I'd like to invite to the stage now to join me. I'll be adding a chair, yeah. I'd like to invite Dr. Mohit Anand, who's Associate Professor in International Business and Strategy at the Emlyon Business School. Welcome, Mohit. Philippe Le Corre, Senior Fellow at Harvard University, Harvard Kennedy School, Visiting Professor at ESSEC Business School. He's going to join us as well. There he is. Kevin, when he returns in a minute. And last but not least, Laurent Vigier, the Chairman of the 5 Capital Executive Committee, Chairman of Friends of the Global Fund Europe, and former Chairman of the Board of Institutional Investors Roundtable. And we will be speaking about unavoidable or avoidable wars, myth or reality, is the Thucydides trap inevitable? What's next for the international liberal order? So, and Kevin will be coming back to join us because it's the topic of his latest book. And if you've read the book, you have a sense of what he thinks. So we can maybe start without him. And I'd like to put it to each of you, actually. Very simple question based on the topic. Can we avoid the Thucydides trap? And when we talk about the Thucydides trap, I hope most of you know what that is, but it's basically, in a nutshell, the idea that a rising power scares and destabilizes an incumbent power to the point where conflict becomes unavoidable. And in the Thucydides version, we're talking about Sparta and Athens. But today, we're talking, obviously, about China and America. So maybe I'll start with you, Mohit. Can we avoid war between China and America, and how, if we can?
Thank you very much. It's a tricky question, and there's no clear answer to it. But what I think is that there's typically, as what analysts said, there are 2 relations between countries, trade or war. And often trade leads to war and war leads to trade. And what we are seeing with US-China is the precedent of trade war, which is a new form of economic war. So I think it really depends how it unfolds. Ukraine conflict, pandemic has made it even more complicated. But I think it needs to be seen as to how it goes ahead. And there is no simple or clear answer to it. What I see it from my own perspective and understanding and writing articles and research on that it seems to be avoidable, but then you have to have some kind of, as what Kevin also said in his book, I will take a word further, that you need to have kind of a competitive collaboration. Find areas of collaboration and try to, kind of back off from areas where there is confrontation. But I think it is avoidable because not only US and China will suffer, but also the other stakeholders will be, pressed between 2 wheels, making it a powder of grain. So I think other countries also have a stake in it to find it or make it from an avoidable to an almost unavoidable war. So I think that's my initial take on that.
So I'm probably going to ask you, as a good journalist should, at the very end to say yes or no, and but we'll do that at the very end. So, Philippe, please.
Thank you, Jamil. Well, let me start with a couple of anecdotes. When I was in China in the 90s, post Tiananmen Square, I would speak to Chinese people, asking them about the state of China, and I could sense a state of disillusion, if not disappointment. There's nothing left in China. There's kind of very pessimistic view about their own culture and their own country, their own nation. So there was no sense that China was aiming at changing the international liberal order. There was not even a hint of that. When I moved to the US in 2014, I was surprised to read everywhere that there were 2 revisionist powers, Russia and China. I found that as a European that was a little bit surprising. But China became gradually the main challenge of the United States. So in China, of course, we've moved from the 90s till now, and we'll see that in the next few days with the Party Congress, the 20th Party Congress, when the United States, which may not be mentioned as often as the Americans do mention China, but it is seen as the great competitor. While in the US, as we saw from Jake Sullivan's statement yesterday and the release of the National Security Strategy of the United States, after 2 years of hard work, that China has become the center topic. So both nations, both cultures, you could say, have convinced themselves that there is the arch enemy. And in the middle, of course, you have Europe, as Kevin Rudd said in his article, one of his many articles yesterday, the one in Le Monde, I believe, where we can actually play a role between these two big poles. But I would say for the time being, I'm not very optimistic, because the ideology has become so preeminent in the way both regimes are talking about each other and are talking about the world situation today.
Laurent, please.
Thank you, Jamil. Well, war are unavoidable only when they have started. Before they have started, they are never been unavoidable. And when you talk about historical precedent, I'm not that much convinced that, well, what happened in a remote corner of Eurasian continent 2,000 years ago between city-states, and none of the city-states were the leading power of the time. It was the Persian Empire or the Chinese Empire were the leading power of the time. Is that relevant for today? But in US political sciences, they have certain talent to coin catch concepts like where Thucydides trap, the end of history, the clash of civilization. And people start to think about this, and it become, at the end of the day, it can become self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think it's very dangerous, and I was very sensitive to what Ruud wrote, saying that better to, what you said this morning about we need to devote more attention to the internal thinking of these countries, how they come to these positions. And because one of the problems is that, you see, the position of China is very much connected to the challenge, internal challenge of China, how consolidate the regime, the communist regime, how fulfill the objectives of development. China has not finished, completed its development objective. There's a lot of poor people in China. So I think, in a nutshell, is Thucydides' trap inevitable? No, because the war has not started. Maybe it will start, maybe not. Hopefully not. But there's also another question, is we are in a very strange situation now, is that war has come back, has made a comeback in the grammar of international relations. Since the end of the communist period, at the heydays of globalization, we had wars, but they were asymmetrical wars, and none of these wars threatened the global order. Now we are in a different situation with the war in Ukraine, the Russian aggression of Ukraine, and all these talks about climbing the escalation ladder to nuclear, the use of nuclear weapons. This is totally new. So what the big question is, what type of war are we facing now? Is it one of these wars that occurred during the Cold War, like the Korean War, like the Vietnam Wars, like the Afghan Wars, that remain local? Or is this a war like the War of Spain, the Balkan Wars in 1913, or the war in Manchuria that were preliminary to a more global war? So I think it's really the question is where we stand, and I think maybe we'll come back there after that. But what the relation, the dialogues that took place between this revisionist power that is Russia and China and the US, and how all this is going to boil.
Kevin, you wrote a whole book on this, so I think you know, I've got to ask you something slightly more probing than can we avoid the Thucydides trap.
Well, I was hoping it would just be that.
Yeah, that's it. Yes or no? Yes or no question.
Go and buy my book and buy lots of it. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So in your scenarios, 5 of the 10 scenarios end in a major conflict. And the way I read it, 8 of 10 scenarios include some sort of war. So you seem to be saying it's possible, but not very likely we can avoid it. So maybe if you could elaborate and some solutions on how to avoid, which you do lay out in the book.
Yeah, I've listened carefully to what my colleagues have said in this discussion, and there are important insights in it. The one I'll build on is from my colleague to my right here about decision makers and policy makers being captured by a narrative. And it's quite important that we're mindful of that. My friend and colleague from Harvard, Graham Allison, wrote Thucydides' Trap, Revisited. And the title of the book, put there by the publishers, not by Graham himself, by the way, is Destined for War. Graham actually fought very hard for it not to be called Destined for War, but they wanted to sell books. And so then, 6 months later, you go to Washington and speak to all the Republicans and Democrats and the House chairs, the committee chairs, and the administration at the time, and they just say, looks like we're destined for war. And I thought, that's interesting. But of course, they hadn't actually read the book. They just read the cover. And that, for some American politicians, equals reading the book, reading the cover. And so the power of a narrative is quite important for us to be aware of. My second point is that's why I took time out to write this book, because I was discovering that this narrative was becoming all-pervasive, to the point that it was immobilizing of those who believe that diplomacy and political leadership and statesmanship has a role, and it does. So why the avoidable war? It's not a piece of what I describe as sprinkling Scandinavian fairy dust across the top of a geopolitical reality. It's a realist book and says there's a strategic competition underway. At present, that strategic competition is unmanaged because the rules of the road have been pushed out the door. And so now you have metal on metal all over the place. And therefore, whereas neither side actually wants a war, at least this decade, because they fear they might lose it, there is a risk of accidental war because of the inevitable politics of incident, escalation, crisis, conflict, and then war. And on the third thing about how do you prevent it, well, none of us can ever prevent these things, but you can, in the world of realpolitik, you can reduce the risk. And I'm into risk reduction because that's the pragmatic way through this. In the absence of any combined view between the two principal powers on what the future of the world should look like, the question is, those who seek to become the preeminent powers of the order, how do you risk minimize war between them? So when I talk about managed strategic competition, there are some practical concepts in there, which are guardrails, rules of the road around Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, Korean Peninsula, cyber and space, which none of them are foolproof, but at present...
None of them exist at the moment.
But there's frankly very little that is currently existing. And so when people say, well, that's fine and dandy, Kevin, it's an elegant theory of strategic guardrails around the red lines, managed non-lethal competition and the rest of the relationship between Washington and Beijing, and still space for collaboration on the global commons like climate, but also global financial stability and global public health. But the critics would say it's just not feasible. I'm not so sure. And there I draw the lessons from diplomatic history. This week we're reflecting on the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And when the Soviet Union and the United States came within a hair's breadth of blowing each other's brains out and blowing the rest of us to pieces as well on the way through. We would have been the new collateral damage to the primary exchange. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a general view which emerged in Moscow and Washington that this was not a good idea. And the evolving political realpolitik of the subsequent decade gave birth under Brezhnev of détente, which in turn gave birth to the Helsinki process, and then the CSCE, and then the OSCE, and then some broad rules of the road which lessened but never eliminated the risks of a renewed major power conflict. So it's not naive to think that these things cannot be done. They can be. It simply requires political will and creativity to get there. And I suspect right now, when the two leaders are preparing for their first face-to-face in Bali next month, that they are working on ways through which to stabilize this relationship. And to stabilize it does not mean normalize it, because I think that's not possible, because they are strategic competitors. But stabilization is possible between strategic competitors, and that reduces the risk of war.
Do you think that Xi's... well, first of all, does Xi Jinping get everything he wants in the few days at the 20th Party Congress? And then...
Yes.
Yes, me too, that's what I think. But once he gets everything he wants, does that give him more space to stabilize the relationship with the United States?
Well, I think... I don't think it'll make the front page of Le Monde, but my prediction will be that Xi Jinping will be reappointed by a narrow majority of 3,268 votes to 0. The one
Maybe that one person who like pressed the wrong button when they fell asleep.
No, that one person who's in doubt is now on a bus to Xinjiang, and very slow bus at that. So when we say he's the paramount leader, it's not a casual term. And I've been a student of Chinese domestic politics, I hate to say it, for 40 years. And I've looked at every Congress in detail since the 12th Party Congress. The concentration of power now within this man is greater than we've seen with anyone since Mao. Not since Deng, but since Mao. Deng was counterbalanced by a guy in the system called Chen Yun. And there just was different forces which were constantly calibrated and balanced within the Chinese body politic. That is not the case now. And so will he therefore be empowered to do something different with the United States? I think he was empowered before the Party Congress. But subsequent to the Party Congress, I think there is a constituency in the Chinese leadership now to stabilize. Why? One, they've radically overreached in their support for Putin on Ukraine, and that is recognized in Beijing as a foreign policy mistake of considerable orders of magnitude. Two, the Chinese economy is slowing radically and is in all sorts of trouble. And three, there's been reputational damage for China because of one above, which is the view now in Europe, which historically was benign towards China in many respects, is now deeply colored by China's tacit support for Vladimir Putin. So I think there is an interest in taking the temperature down. Not to remove the strategic competition, the race remains. And you're going to see in the 20th Party of Congress a lot of elucidations of where China will be by 2035 and 2049. So the ideological task of prevailing in this struggle against the current world order will continue. But for the immediate period, by which I mean the next several years, I think there is an interest in taking the temperature down from 9 out of 10 to something like 4 or 5 out of 10, if they can. But the competition goes on.
Thank you. I'm going to work my way back this way. Laurent, China is now predicted to grow slower than the rest of Asia for the first time in decades this year, partly because of the implosion of the real estate market, which I predicted 10 years ago, and it's hopefully finally, well, not hopefully, but it's finally coming true. For my reputation, it's helpful. And also these COVID-0 lockdowns, which may or may not, there's a lot of talk in China that they will be lifted after the 20th Party Congress. There'll be less focus on total zero. How are investors here in Europe in particular, how do they see China now and the Chinese economy and where it's headed?
Well, it's more and more complex because you see, a few years ago, everybody wanted to be in China. Now it's more complicated. The borders have been closed for a long time. The crackdown, well, the anti-corruption campaign led by Xi Jinping, certainly justified in many respects, but has created some kind of uncertainty in the business climate. When suddenly you see some of your partners that disappear or vanish, when you see the crackdown on some of the most important tycoons, like Jack Ma, for example, it's really something that is puzzling. And it seems that in a way, at some stage, and we will see if after the party Congress, there is a change of direction. But it seems that Xi Jinping has prioritized the consolidation of the regime, of the grip of the Communist Party on China over the economic development. And it creates a degree of uncertainty. But at the same time, you see also that many players, I think, for example, in the Middle East, I'm based in the Middle East, you see they are more and more looking towards China. So it's more complex. We need to analyze the situation, the shifting situation. Clearly, China remains a top priority, but we should also look at other opportunities. Also, the reshuffling, the reorganization of global supply chains, all the debate about resilience, it's something that will bring probably some investors to reevaluate their asset allocation between China, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and even the Middle East. The Middle East are certainly a card to play in that respect.
Philippe, a couple of questions for you. One is, I and many others, I think, have always assumed that the modern Communist Party, post-Deng, really relies on rapid economic growth for its legitimacy. And if we're seeing the end of that, what does that mean, do you think, for the legitimacy of the party? And has Xi Jinping, I guess, built up enough nationalism to kind of counterweigh that? What's your sense?
Well, obviously, the zero COVID policy has had devastating consequences on people's morale. I think the party has taken a hit in the summer in places like Shanghai, and the ideological stance that is now ingrained in this zero COVID policy. And the fact that the zero COVID policy is some kind of an excuse for more tightening of domestic politics, I think is a risky proposition for that party, especially if the economy doesn't grow as fast as it used to be. So if you only tighten up and if you only impose new things on people, even though I was referring earlier, people are kind of used to suffer and having a hard time in China. They're also used to having a good time. The 1990s, then the 2000s, and since China joined the WTO in 2001, China has had 30 years of continuing growth and success, and has now become one of the main beneficiaries of globalization. So the key question is whether this integration into the global world is going to be replaced by this kind of isolationist feeling, and China looking at itself, and it's kind of self-reliance and this attitude, which I don't believe the majority of the Chinese people want. So this party will have on this sort of relationship with the U.S. I mean, I agree with Kevin in the sense that the two leaders have to sit down and they do have to talk and stabilize as much as they can. but we've got this party congress coming up, and then there'll be other political events in China, and then there's the Taiwan Strait crisis, and in the US we have the midterm elections. So unfortunately this will continue because things have become politicized, as the Chinese Communist Party say. But in terms of domestic situation in China, I think Xi Jinping is gambling. The zero COVID policy, which unfortunately will not stop, is a gamble in the sense that it will not help China to continue its economic growth and its outreach to the world.
I'll get to you in a second, but Kevin, same question for you. Is the end of sort of super high rates of growth, is that destabilizing? Is that very dangerous, existential even for Xi Jinping?
I think it's important for us to understand how he views reality. And for my sins, I've been reading this in some detail for the last several years. Xi Jinping's analytical framework is quite dialectical in a classic Marxist-Leninist sense. And what do I mean by that? He looks at the Chinese private sector, and Jack Ma, who he knows particularly well because they're both from Hangzhou and have been for recently in Zhejiang. And what Xi Jinping concluded dialectically is that where the party was going with the rise of the private sector under Deng, Zhang and Hu was a communist party which would increasingly be marginalized by the rising power of the private sector and of the entrepreneurial class within it. And so as a good dialectician, he looked at this trend, this 主流, as the Chinese would say, and said, 不行, I'm not going to sit around for that. And so he didn't accidentally say, I'm going to crack down on the private sector for fun because I'm feeling grumpy with Jack. It's actually a dialectical response. But the second part of my argument is that to every dialectical response, there's an equal and opposite dialectical reaction. And so, as you've correctly said, and my colleagues here on the panel have correctly said, the level of alienation on the part of the entrepreneurial class is large, and they do like fun. And there's not a lot of fun at the moment, a lot of terror and not a lot of fun. Secondly, if the population at large do not have a sustained increase in living standards, but they begin to stagnate, and keep a very clear eye on this, what we call in the Asia Society or in our analytical work, the 19% project, which is 19% youth unemployment, and that includes a lot of college graduates. And then you add to that various other critiques and reactions in the system through, for example, the sinification of religion. People often don't talk about this in the analysis, but when you've got 100 million Protestant Christians, 10 or 15 million Catholics, 300 million Buddhists, and say 20 million Muslims have all been told you've got to sinify your religious practice, that is a lot of reaction. So my question is this one. As a matter of politics, can these be coalesced at some point in the future by a group within the party or an individual within the party to represent a significant policy and political challenge to Xi Jinping? At present, I can't see that, but these structural forces are at work. Or is Xi Jinping now the master of so much of the surveillance technologies of the country through the surveillance state that, unlike in previous periods in authoritarian history, be it Soviet or Chinese, it no longer matters, and that is that the surveillance state can now control all? That, for me, is the unanswered question.
To come back to a little bit, your very good article the other day, which I read with great interest. I want to come back to that in a bit. But one of the founders of Asia Society France, I won't say who, told me before that there's sometimes a suggestion that that Asia Society is a very China society sometimes. So I want to also give some space and some time to other parts of Asia. And I wanted to ask you, Mohit, about India's role in this conflict, because it's a very interesting, very interesting position. An old friend of Russia, a member of the Quad, Japan, Australia, United States, and India, but fought border skirmishes with China just 2 years ago. So how and under, you know, Prime Minister Modi is going in a somewhat more authoritarian direction than has previously been the case, at least since maybe Indira Gandhi. But perhaps you could sort of give us a sense of what India's role is, how India in this these sort of power dynamics, and where you see India headed as well.
Well, from the India perspective, of course, prior to the rise of China, the entire discourse was mostly Western-oriented. You know, the light comes from the West and the North, and now you have the rise of China. So India is somewhere caught in between, and it also goes with, probably there's a saying in China that, you know, for China, Asia is the mountain and they are the only tiger, while India says, where's the room for the elephant, you know, which is India. And also probably it also goes with the philosophy of Gandhi that the world does enough for everyone's need, but not enough for a single man's, well, in this case, one country's greed for being the hegemonic power. So I think India's approach has largely been of being neutral and having, well, I like you and I like you as well. Recently and more of certain, what India has seen under, particularly under Prime Minister Modi, is more masculine and hard posturing of India's approach. That yes, we have the Panchashila, or the 5 virtues of foreign policy, of non-interference and kind of non-allying, but well, I'll stand on places and I'll take a position on places which really suits my national interest, and so to speak, my selfish national interest. So yes, of course, that is there, but I think India is rising, and I think I personally feel that the rise of India in terms of diplomatic, informational, military, and economic has to go in its evolutionary increment of its economy. You cannot speak about the rise of India and other countries, be it Indonesia or Mexico and others rising emerging markets, unless you have a huge economic weight like China. So China's rise and more above and beyond economic and trade into political power came precisely over the last 10, 12 years. The noise that we are seeing from China is over the last 10, 12 years when it became number 2 largest economy, or even on PPP is the largest economy. So I think India understands that yes, we have a role to play, but that role has to be substantiated with its rising economic power. For that, it has to uplift millions of people out of poverty, give a decent livelihood and living standard to millions of people who have been relatively unserved and underserved. It's improving, but it's still half glass full, and the rest of the world looks at half glass empty. On diplomatic side, India has done a lot of this overwhelmingly over-activism. For example, you know, the India-Africa summit, the Indo-ASEAN, and India's posturing of its diplomacy has moved from, you know, aligning towards the post-colonial, the Western-looking, or on one side, the Russia, you know, the Soviet Union, towards more look east and act east. So I think that has also helped. The coming year is going to be very critical for India for probably 3 reasons. I think the next year India is going to be in the electoral mood. It could be probably Modi 3.0 in 2024. So that is a year before it will start. Second, India is currently the president of SCO, which is on one side of the multipolar, rising multilateral organization with China, Russia, India, Iran, probably an excess of Turkey could join in, and Central Asian countries. And in December, India also takes up the presidency of G20 from Indonesia. And in the middle, you also have India being the presidency of United Nations Security Council in December. So it's going to be a very big, hot diplomatic point boiler. Now the question is how India plays its card while standing on its own feet and yet taking a stand for the world and finding a balancing act between this international liberal order, as what the West says. So it's going to be tricky.
I try to ask about India. You still talk about China. It's, I have a small anecdote. I won't name the ambassador, but I remember in Beijing speaking to the Indian ambassador at the time, and he said to me, and it was astonishing, he said, China, this is a while ago, but he said, China will go to war with one of its neighbors in the next 5 to 10 years, and it's my job to make sure it's not India, that it's Vietnam or Philippines or someone else. I thought that was a very interesting example of realpolitik. Kevin, you want to say something?
I think the exposition of India's central role in the unfolding geopolitics and geoeconomics of the avoidable war is critical. And I think to build on the remark just made about Modi's new script, I've just spent about 7 or 8 days in Delhi with opening our Asia Society Policy Institute Centre in Delhi, and spent a lot of time with the Indian government. And I was quite surprised. I hadn't been there since prior to COVID. And the level of policy shift on 2 or 3 fronts. One, the border clash of 2020 has had a seismic impact on the Indian foreign security policy and economic policy establishment. This is now a sea change. India no longer sees it possible to have a normal relationship with China. To paraphrase Prime Minister Modi, at least as reflected to me by others, the government has put in huge effort with 3 large-scale summits between Modi and Xi Jinping, and each time they've had a summit, more land is taken on the border by the Chinese side. There's a deep strategic conclusion on this in Delhi, which is bushing. That is, we don't believe this is a basis for a long-term stable relationship. 2, therefore, you do see a renewed turn for India's future economic security and opportunity to the open economies of the West, new FTAs being negotiated with Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the European Union, and if the crazy Americans could discover free trade again, maybe with the crazy Americans too, because the protectionism in the current crazy Congress doesn't permit that. And 3, this is I think the really interesting bit, is that Modi is a highly intelligent political leader. He sees the problem that the collective world now has with the geopolitical security of Chinese supply chains, as China became the world's factory over a 20 to 30 year period. He sees that as an opportunity for India to move in this direction. He sees that as being impossible if India, however, does not undertake its own renewable energy transition. The sea change in India on climate and renewable energy at a policy level is huge. And I think if there's a vision which is emerging, if he can translate it into reality, is to harness these factors into a green, sustainable supply chain out of India, which is geopolitically reliable for the rest of the world, and that the climate change transition or transformation opportunity is primarily about an economic transformation opportunity, mindful of the fact that India's future power is entirely based on its future economic power. So I think this is nascent, but it's unfolding. Oh, by the way, my final correction on you thinking that we, the Asia Society, are the China Society, is we don't have a centre in China other than Hong Kong. We now have 2 centres in India, and we have multiple centres in the rest of Asia. And in our think tank, we have many more staff working on the rest of Asia than we do on China.
Good. It's just that your specialty and my specialty happen to be China, so apologies in advance. It's probably going to be mostly China today. I would like to, Laurent, perhaps, could I ask you how India plays here in Europe and for France, maybe in particular? What is the role of India? How is it seen as a partner? They're not a huge trade partner, but they are a trade partner. And what role does India in particular play for France and for Europe more broadly?
Well, I'm not that much a specialist in India, so we have a lot of interest in India. A lot of French companies have interest in India. I can tell you, for example, that one of the leading French engineering company called Aegis is very much involved in development infrastructure project in India. We sold the Rafale also to India. So there's a strategic partnership that's developing between France and India, but the level of the economic relation between France and India is still something to come and to be developed. And probably in the green transition, in the tech sectors, whereas India has clearly a leading edge, there are a lot of things to do. But India is much lagging behind China. The big French company have an increasing interest in India, but for a long time they were absolutely fascinated by China. It started to shift.
Just on Rafale, I'll give you a second. I just have a tiny anecdote. I bumped into the representatives of Rafale in the crazy waiting room of the defense minister of India once, and it was just, they made you wait in this thing, and there were all sorts of people there, supplicants, and there was the Rafale people in there too, and it was, anyway, very interesting. Please.
Them everywhere, you know,
they're
sometimes
everywhere,
in unexpected places. No, I just wanted to add on what's been said, that perhaps India could also play a role in soft power, and economics is one thing, but when you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that took place in Central Asia, the fact there were all these countries around the table, they did not give a full support to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was no unanimity, and there was no full, statements supporting what Putin has been done. So perhaps the fact that around this table, which has become, more and more numerous, the fact that India, as a democracy, is now a prominent member of SCO, I think is a rather good thing, because at the end of the day, what people see when they watch news on their television screens is sort of the rise of autocracies, the rise of Iran, with many problems on the streets, of course, the rise of Putin in Russia, with many problems in Ukraine, of course, and as we discussed in China, it's far from being so simple. There's some backsides to the zero COVID policy and to the sort of harsh authoritarianism of the CCP. So the fact, there are actually countries that are part of the global south and prominent centers of the global south that have a different model, go in the direction of a multipolar world, which we are in already. It's a few years ago, Americans in fact were making jokes about this. There was just one pole, and the rest had to follow. Now, of course, the multipolar world is there, and certainly India can play a role there. So there is space for somebody who was not China, was not the US, was not Europe, was not Russia. I think that's an interesting one.
What I want to press you a little bit, since you are French, right? So, how realistic is this idea of strategic autonomy? And when President Macron talks about strategic autonomy, he really means not sort of relying on America too much, right? But how does Europe, how does France achieve this without sort of falling into the arms of China? Or, I mean, how do you see this as a concept, and vis-a-vis Asia, particularly China?
So it's a matter of striking a balance between values of interests. I mean, when you look at the way Europe has been dealing with China over the past 30 years, you see a clear evolution since 2019, when it started calling China both a partner and a systemic rival and a competitor, and it's put names on it. So the problem, if you're a Brussels bureaucrat, is to strike
three contradictory names on it, which is very Brussels. It's extremely
obviously
EU.
China doesn't like the systemic rivalry part, but actually it's calls a cat, as we say in French. The Chinese system is different from the European system. So to answer your question on the strategic autonomy, I think autonomy is a good word. Strategic autonomy, I'm not too sure, but certainly Europe has been somewhat strengthened by the unstable geopolitical environment of the past 2 years. The war in Ukraine has strengthened not just NATO, but the European Union. When you listen to, I mean, I know you're based in Brussels now, but when you listen to Mrs. von der Leyen, she appears more and more as a war leader, which would nobody have dreamt of 10 years ago when talking about the president of the European Commission, who was really seen as a bureaucrat, sort of handling trade issues and perhaps, you know, a few other things that were not of interest to the general public. So this has changed, and I think Europe has become a player. Now, with regard to China, I know that certainly the Beijing leadership would love to engage with Europe as a sort of good cop, as opposed to a bad cop, and Europe itself could play that sort of role as a middleman. I think that's, you know, on China that could be the case. Obviously, it didn't work out on Russia. Macron tried to engage with Putin at the start of this disastrous war, and he failed. He faced a very stubborn dictator who is interested in revenge. It's more than revisionism. It's revenging. So on China, of course, China sees the world differently. You know, they like to talk about 5,000 years of history. They like to talk about you know, Tangxia. They like to talk about, you know, the big picture, and therefore Europe can be an interlocutor as a sort of an old civilization. You know, I don't know if you've been to Greece recently, but China has published a book of comparing Chinese and Greek philosophers, and this is part of their soft power strategy. Try to convince the Greeks that you know, they are equal to the Chinese. So you wouldn't see that in America, obviously, because they kind of look down on this 200-year civilization.
I grew up in New Zealand, and I've followed very closely New Zealand's relations with China and attitudes to China. And the way I described it is a combination of naivety, ignorance, and greed. And having arrived in Europe about a year ago.
Good thing the ambassador's left.
She left. That's why I looked around. I looked around to see if she was still here. She might be watching the live stream.
And the world thought Australians were blunt. My God.
But and when I arrived in Europe about a year ago, it really those same description is kind of how I felt about many of the attitudes here in Europe, and I would say particularly in Germany. But also to an extent in France. So I wonder, I'm being provocative obviously, but I wonder what you think, Laurent, and for people here who know China, know Asia well, is that how you describe it, or how would you describe the sort of the general, not the expert view, but the general view of the rise of China in the world and Asia more generally?
Well, studying. I've been many times to China. It's much more complex than seen from outside. There are internal debate, a lot of sophistication, but it's also a society where you feel that they have gone through a lot of traumas, and you still feel that there were these traumas. And in a way, you see, I think, considering China as a threat is something very external. They have so many challenges to cope with. The way they have developed the population is absolutely stunning. And I think now you seeing China is not only the factory of the world, it's now one of the centers that produce innovation. And that's something that's I think the shift in perception is that realizing the sophistication of China beyond the history, which is a catchword, a long history. Europe has a long history, actually, like China. So I wouldn't say China, we had our dark times, but China also had its dark times. So I wouldn't oppose it. I think a lot of caricature. But at the same time, I think the development, stunning development, huge challenge, complexity, and people who have also, I see a lot in the Middle East, I see a lot of Chinese people, they want to enjoy life also. And that's also a big difference. I think the big difference in the world today, and when you speak about the risk of war, you see, to fight a global war, you need to have people who have nothing to lose. Now we have middle classes who have people who have things to lose. They don't want to. So I'm really doubtful about the risk of a global fight, because I think the population, they want something different now, and they are much more educated.
Kevin, I guess what I'm getting at is something you've pointed out, that China's invested quite serious resources into understanding, particularly America, but you know, the West in general and the world in general. And we haven't. My experience is not the same. The same investment hasn't been made in most Western countries to understand China, the rise of China.
Yeah, I think there is. I often think that China and the United States are condemned to mutually assured non-comprehension, not just mutually assured destruction if it goes really wrong. And there is always a problem, as we know, in international relations of what we call in the industry mirror imaging, and I think both systems are capable of it. The Chinese system is capable of assuming that the United States will never act militarily to defend Taiwan because it's not a rational thing to do from an American national interest point of view. And I keep saying to my Chinese friends, I don't think that is a wise assumption. Similarly, the American mirror image of the Chinese can often be this: why would they ever put at risk the entire party and their economic achievements over several decades by rolling the dice on Taiwan? And the answer to that is you don't quite understand the high religion and theology of the one China policy and the incomplete nature of the revolution of 1949. So we do have a degree of mutual non-comprehension. I think on the broader question, which you've been addressing with other colleagues on the panel, what we are all struggling with here in France, in the United States, in Australia, where none of us have complete wisdom on these subjects, we're all struggling with an underlying reality that China has changed. The China that many of us have become familiar with for 35 years, certainly since I first went there as a kid, through until the 18th Party Congress, and to some extent the 19th Party Congress in 2017, was the China of Deng Xiaoping plus a continued reform and opening. Deng saying that these doctrines would remain in place for dozens of generations. The China which hadn't determined its trajectory in terms of what sort of global power it wanted to be, and still from time to time entertained periods of levels of social and even small p political liberalization, despite Tiananmen. That's the China we all kind of got used to, at a corporate level, diplomatic level, at a social level. And most of us have dozens of close friends in the country. Then suddenly something happened on the way to the bank, which was Xi Jinping arrived with a radically different Marxist-Leninist worldview. And we are now wrestling with a China which is undertaking a fundamental domestic course correction itself under him. And therefore, it is a China which now says that the period of reform and opening, while not technically over, is now not the central narrative. The central narrative is a China of national economic self-sufficiency against the inevitability, as they see it, of a showdown with the United States over Taiwan. That their landing point for the world and their role in it is now the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is China as a preeminent power regionally and globally, and beginning to rewrite the international system. And that for Chinese domestic society, the tolerance, the diversity, the liberality, if you like, that we saw, is now being put into reverse mode We go to a Chinese university these days, there are now limited access to Western texts. 5 years ago, if you were studying at Beida, China's leading university, you could pick up any book on any subject in the library, but not in the general community, because there was a view that Chinese elites had to understand the world. So what we're all wrestling with in all of our different engagements is the change profoundly in this central narrative, and by a guy who, as I said at the outset, who is, for the period that we can foresee ahead, the dominant driving force and political control mechanism of the country. So I think that explains our complexity, and therefore, whether I'm in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, London, or whether I'm in Tokyo, Seoul, or Mexico City, or Ottawa, and certainly in Canberra, every single state and corporate community, including their chambers of commerce, is now in this complex process of recalibration. How much can we continue to embrace and engage this unfolding new semi-authoritarian reality? And how much are we now looking at the need to draw lines? That, I think, is our dilemma.
Really liked in that piece I referenced earlier how you described how Xi Jinping has taken China in politics, domestic politics, towards the Leninist left, in economics to the Marxist left, and in international relations to the nationalist right. I thought it was very neat, and I liked it a lot, but I wanted to challenge you slightly and say, isn't it a little more simple? Isn't Xi Jinping an irredentist, ethno-nationalist, totalitarian imperialist?
Far be it for me to say that Australians are more subtle than New Zealanders, but because we never have been. I think the final landing points of the Xi Jinping project are not all coloured in yet. There are outlines of where I think it's going and where the analytical community think it's going, but we're not quite sure yet. So when you conclude with a bold statement like irredentism and revisionism and the rest, I think that's a little too extreme at this stage. What I've tried to do when I came up with my own triptych about the Leninist left, the Marxist left, and the nationalist right was to make sense of 4 years of study of reading Xi Jinping's ideological literature, which I did. I don't recommend it to any of you, by the way.
You did it so we don't have to. That's yeah.
Well, no. Someone should check whether I've got it wrong, but you need a long glass of scotch if you're going to do that stuff. But that's where I come out, because if you look at the high statements of ideology, which are entrenched in party congresses, which is why when this one happens this coming Sunday, I really don't care too much about the personnel appointments. They're much less important because there's one personnel now, and his name is Xi, and everything else is derivative. What I'm really looking at is the ideological content of the work report. Are we going to see a shift and a course correction on the economy because growth is slowing? I don't think so, but it could be. What I'm more worried about also ideologically, do we see a shift in China's formal ideological definition of its view of its external threat environment, which for 20 years has been described by the Chinese as benign, a period of great strategic opportunity, which in the ideological dialect, that means no major wars on the horizon. That's what they actually subdefine it as meaning, which means that we can prioritize the economy. What I fear is that we may see in the Congress report a document which says that security and national security is now the central preoccupation of the system, or at least co-equal with the economy. And what's that code language for? We, the Chinese system, must now begin looking at going on to a longer-term war footing. That's what I'm worried about, is that sort of code language in the system.
My other panelists, anyone can take it. Do you think that's how politicians, policymakers in Europe and India, is that how they see things? Do they see, like your India's former ambassador to China, do they see China on this path towards war, or do you think that there's a much more optimistic view, which is the sense I sometimes get.
Well, I think India does see China as a big threat, politically, economically, even culturally. But I think it also stems from the fact that, and I can say previous to your previous question, I think what the world is looking at, that we like Chinese money, we like Chinese investment, but we're not willing to accept its political hegemony. So you need, it comes, nothing comes like a free lunch. So you have to accept that. And I think India also accepts to that fact that in spite of the Galwan clash that we had, it was the first kind of a kind of a war, you know, in a primitive kind of fashion. Trade is still continuing. And on the contrary, it has stabilized, if not reduced. So I think it's wishful thinking that, okay, you cannot talk about China's rise just politically. It is backed with a lot of trade, innovation, and economic power. So I think this is something that India in particular has to look into. And as what Kevin said, India is trying to diversify. You know, you have now Apple factory there, and Samsung has come up, and the idea of make in India and try to diversify. And I think it also helps countries in Europe and US to find other partners and countries, you know, to put their eggs in different baskets. And I think Vietnam has done pretty well. You know, it's a small country, but has done a free trade agreement with Europe, you know, and India is still planning to do it. It's in stages, and so with UK. So I think a lot of work has to be done by other countries in Asia if we want to match up to China in terms of its political and economic dominance. But I think it's up to a point there, but it will take time. And I think the other point that I would like to say, just to say that I think we are still living in, as the title says, you know, the liberal international order. The question is who defines that, and who do you ask that, right? And if you look at from Asian perspective, particularly from Indian perspective, is the post-Bretton Woods, Western-dominated, Western-influenced, discourse that have rule, and now we are looking to superimpose a new Oriental Chinese map on that, you know, and I think that then the question is, which one suits you more? And that's a dilemma that countries like India and others are facing, what to do about that. And I think that's going to be another challenge for India and other countries in middle to find a pathway.
I fully agree. I think Jake Sullivan, again, the U.S. National Security Advisor, yesterday was saying the post-Cold War era was over. He didn't say the international order or the rules-based international order was over, but certainly this emergence of a new giant, which not only is a strong economic power, but is also a technological power, has changed the shape of globalization. I think, you know, Europeans, to go back to your earlier question, are concerned with state-owned enterprises, the role of the state in the Chinese economy, the fact there's no more liberal business in a way. I mean, the sort of the way China behaves on the markets is quite different from what come from the globalization as we knew it before. So that's the concern. That sort of brings the Europeans into a more autonomous way of thinking, because many European companies are questioning their presence in China, because they see that the game is sort of unfair. And also the other thing is the technology. You now have a sort of a China that is imposing standards and norms on technology. You know, the internet, the Chinese internet is quite different from the one that is US sponsored. So how you choose your camp, you know? And China is pushing its own system through, you know, many countries, especially in the global south, while the US is trying to keep its, domination over technology. So that's another war that we haven't really spoken in details, which I think is much more critical.
A 30-second advertisement for the Asia Society. We've been looking at this technological standards struggle between the United States and the Europeans on the one hand, and China on the other across all the technology categories. So if you go to the Asia Society website, you'll see a series called Stacking the Deck, which is about this. And it's a whole new pathway of work which we're undertaking, because it's profoundly important given the centrality of technology and the emerging technologies as the drivers of the next wave of economic growth and therefore consequential economic power.
Well, you see, from Europe for a long time we had quite different perception of China than the US. You see, the US have thought about China as an emerging competitor, and even thinking about the new US strategic concept that was published yesterday, saying that the post-Cold War order was over, and now we enter into a renewed period of great power competition, including on the military side. It's something that the US are much more advanced in that respect, but probably Europe, and France in particular, for a long time has considered China more as a trade partner than as a real competitor, probably because we perceive China as being much more far away than the US, because they are facing each other across the Pacific. But things are starting to change. We need to consider that for a long time we lived with a China which was a challenger to the US. Number 2 economy, growing rapidly, catching up. We're going to enter in a period where China, maybe already, maybe in a few years' time, will become the first economic power in the world. And in view of its population, there's no reason to think that they're going to remain at parity with the US. The size of China's economy can be perfectly twice the size of the US within 20 years down the road. So it's a completely different world that we enter. And we see this, there is a growing awareness about rising competition. For example, the way France has positioned and Europe has positioned itself regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, or about Huawei and Chinese data collection through the networks and the telecom infrastructure. These are something which introduce a shift in perception. Also, competition with China and Africa. Well, it was business competition, but there was probably also an element of strategic competition. Now, I think a lot will depend on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. If Russia is severely defeated, you see this alliance that has crystallized between China and Russia, there will be a question. Will China decrease the pressure in its relation with the West? Or will the US consider, okay, that they have been able to press the failure of this of Russia attempt to redefine the global order, and then China is next on the list. So then there will be a question of how to manage the post-war. You have also another scenario, is that there's not a complete defeat of Russia in Ukraine, but there is a kind of freezing of the war, and there is a kind of ceasefire, and we have another war a few years down the road, and maybe a fourth war, and Europe remain an area of tension and instability for a long time. And in that case, what will be the position of China towards this new environment? And so the risk of the increase of tension between Europe and China will very much depend on the way China will manage this, the exit of this war in Ukraine, and if it will play the role of a stabilizer in the global system, or if it will continue to develop an alternative system to the global system established after World War II and the end of communism.
Just to pick up the point about the growth of the Chinese economy, because that's really important to our collective analysis. We've touched on it before with Xi Jinping changing the growth model out of the reform and opening period and the Deng Xiaoping model of the past to Xi Jinping's new development model, which is much more based in the party state, greater room for the state-owned enterprise sector, less room for the private sector, more constrained operations for tech platforms, crackdown on property, both for good reasons that you pointed to in terms of financial risk, but curious ideological reasons where Xi Jinping defines the property sector as containing within it the fictitious economy of speculative capital, a direct lift, by the way, from Capital 1848, which has not had a hugely positive effect on property stocks in either Shanghai or Shenzhen. So why do I say all that? The future resolution coming out of this Congress of the actual content of the economic development model will determine whether by the 2030s and the 2040s, China is 3x America in terms of GDP measured at market exchange rates, 2x or 1x. And the maths are fairly straightforward. If this economy of China's grows as it was assumed by 5 to 6% during its middle income period, then by the late 20s it's 2x America, and by the late 30s, it's 2x America, by the late 40s it's 3x America. And Xi Jinping's confidence about China therefore acting with an enormous gravitational pull on the global economy. However, if it grows at 2 to 3%, which is what it's currently stumbling around with, and primarily driven not by COVID problems, but in my view, a continuing cocktail of demography and ideology. If it's 2 to 3% growth, then you end up with the Chinese economy as you move towards mid-century, which is either a little bit smaller than America's or a little bit larger, but not much. This is quite profound in terms of where it leaves all of us. And that's why there's this huge question mark about where China lands on the economy. And it's, again, the complexity that we're all dealing with, not just the change from the China of 35 years ago, of the last 35 years, I should say, and the Xi Jinping China of post-12, post-2017, but the new, as it were, lead weight he's delivering to the Chinese economic model in his new period.
It gets to a question that I wrote down and that you have kind of touched on there is, do you think, panelists, do you think we've already passed peak China, or in terms of economics, in terms of maybe even geostrategic power, or do you think it's going to overtake America and that's where we're headed? What do you think, Philippe?
Well, I think, as I was saying earlier, the war in Ukraine and somewhat what happened over the Taiwan Straits this summer has shown also the resilience of the democratic world. Certainly I find a European Union that is much more unified, with the outlier being Hungary's Viktor Orban, perhaps. This is pretty good news for the future of democracy. I find the war in Ukraine also reinforcing the transatlantic dialogue and link when you think about the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council, which has become a fairly operational body. So these are good things for those who want to preserve democracy. And I was saying earlier, also in Asia, countries like India, Japan, South Korea, that are more or less, scared of China's rise. As we know, China is mainly interested in dominating Asia as opposed to imposing its model over the world. It doesn't see itself as a conquering system certainly for old civilizations like we have in Europe, but it sees its influence rising and potentially being stronger in developing countries. So I think it depends where you stand. The Europeans at the moment are very focused on Ukraine, and they see what's happening in East Asia as perhaps a remote possibility. But what happened over the summer sort of was a bit of a wake-up call, and that leads to another question, which is how to handle a war on Taiwan, and how should Europe respond to a call for sanctions, for example, if there was a similar situation happening in Asia with the US getting involved and asking for the Europeans to take a stance and imposing economic sanctions on China, while in fact China is, the first economic partner of the European Union, and that has been for quite a few years. So that may not, I mean, that is a problem, but also, things are changing, companies are leaving. So we'll see. In the next few years, I think will be very interesting to watch.
Well, I think China is going to face some headwinds in terms of its future economic growth. I think one of them is the aging population. So there is this notion that China may become older before it gets richer, and probably it's also going to suffer from this so-called middle income trap. And it's very difficult to move away from this gravitational orbital force that makes you to move away from a middle income to high income country. And I think for China to achieve that, and therefore move away from 5 or 4% growth, which is the new normal for China, I think they cannot have this confrontational approach. And I think what we're also seeing is different hybrid kind of, wars that are happening, which are other than the hopefully unavoidable military war, which is techonomic Cold War or trade war or geopolitical confrontation. So I think China at one point would have to find a way forward. But what I see from an Indian perspective and from other Southeast Asian perspective is that I think for China, discourse and putting out this kind of positioning that, okay, this is what we aim, and this is probably in line with China's vision of achieving its 2-century goal by 2048 to be what they call as a moderate economy, developed economy in a moderate sense, needs to be achieved. The only problem I feel is the demographics and how China collaborates or confronts with the rest of the world, particularly India, its Asian partners, because it has problems with all its neighbors. And vice versa, you can say that. So I think,
except Pakistan and North Korea.
Well, yes, and
actually they have problems with North Korea.
Yes, yeah. So that's where it is. So I think for India and other countries, they have. If my adversary and your adversary is common, we are friends. So whether it's Japan, Australia, the Quad, the AUKUS, or the Indo-Pacific. So India is also trying to do this multi-alignment and positioning to find a kind of a chess play vis-a-vis, the other games that are going on. And it's not going to be that easy.
A quick comment about your question about peak China. Nothing would horrify Xi Jinping more than the fact that in the last 3 months around the world, the debate about peak China has begun. This is debate which is 30 years ahead of its time in the worldview of Xi Jinping. On the substance of it, when the growth rate began to slow radically during the course of 2022, what I found fascinating at an analytical level was the direction from Xi Jinping to provincial party leaders to redouble efforts to revitalize economic growth, quote, to not fall behind the United States, unquote, given the geopolitical imperative which he sees. On the substance of whether China's growth is peaking, either economically or geopolitically, as Zhou Enlai is famously said to have said once about the French Revolution, it's simply too early to tell what its real significance is. But I do agree with peak China, it is too early to tell. The fact that we're having this debate now is of itself remarkable. And most of the causative factors have come out of Xi Jinping's change in leadership course from where it was before to where it's now going. And so there are variables impacting on the peak China debate are huge now, but the fact is the debate is on. for any optimist lying in, branches of the United States government to assume, well, it's all over, China's going to implode into a barrel of internal contradictions, blah, 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 blah. I've read so many reports to that effect for the last 35 years, I've learned to dismiss those as well. But the fact that we're now having a considered and textured debate on peak China is of itself remarkable.
And can be, as history shows us, the most dangerous moment when an aspirant power rising sees it sees that arc tilting downwards. They can think that this is the moment we have to grab. This is when we have to do it, as we saw with World War I, obviously, and other cases. The question I get all the time, and then I will try to tilt away from China slightly again. The question I get a lot is, what did Xi Jinping know about Putin's plans to invade Ukraine? What were those discussions when Putin went to the closing of the Winter Olympics and they said the limitless partnership, and then what was it, a week later, 3 days later, that he invaded Ukraine? What do we think, or what do you know? Maybe you know. I have my views, but I'd love to. Do you still see this, the intelligence reports, Kevin? Australia knows.
I'm just checking my text feed from Xi Jinping.
Yeah, exactly.
There's Xi Jinping, 26 February 2022.
Bloody Putin.
Bloody Putin didn't tell me anything. So the answer is we don't know. But the bottom line is, and I'll be brief about this because I generally don't know, is the real error the Chinese committed was the strategic partnership without limits on the 4th of February. And if you think that that's not regarded now by the Chinese as a mistake, the political fate of Le Yucheng, the then Chinese vice foreign minister, who from being the likely guy to become foreign minister to now being relegated to some obscure role in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference or wherever he's gone.
The Council Information Office.
Thank you. Same thing. Even worse. It's like being made, mayor of Wollongong, in Australia. Sorry for anyone from Wollongong here in Australia. That indicates the Chinese system said this was wrong, the leader can never be wrong, the official was wrong, and the official is gone. That's kind of the haiku summary of what happened. So I think China's, what actually happened in the room between the two of them on the 4th of February, as they were about to go out and watch the figure skating at the Beijing Winter Olympics, I have no idea. But what I found equally fascinating was the Putin's statement in Samarkand recently, where he said, looking happy, not, quote, I'm looking forward to my discussions with my Chinese friend, Xi Jinping, to discuss China's questions and concerns over the Ukraine, unquote. That is not spontaneous Putin speak. So my summation from that is how the Chinese, realizing that things are going so badly in Ukraine, simply said to the Russians, you either get your guy to say this or our guy will say that. And of course, the Russians chose the least damaging course. So whatever happened in the room, it's not turned out entirely well. And that's why China, you should all buckle up for a new Chinese charm offensive right across Europe as it seeks to put as much distance as it can between the foolishness of February this year and where China now seeks to rebuild its standing in Paris, in Berlin, in Brussels, and right across Europe. Because the European constituency is really important for Xi Jinping's long-term geopolitical play. As I've said elsewhere in Paris and in Brussels this week, China views Europe as the swing state in the geopolitics of the 20th century. You are one giant purple state in the Chinese geopolitical calculus, and therefore they know that they have played a very bad card so far on Ukraine.
Well, I think we don't know what was precisely discussed between Putin and Xi at the closure of the Winter Olympics. But my feeling, I've been very much involved with Russia for the past 15 years. And my conviction is that, in a way, the Russians have hijacked the Chinese agenda and have attracted the Chinese in a losing fight. A bit like Austria-Hungary during World War I attracted Germany into the World War. You see, after 2014, Russia shifted. They started to speak more and more about nuclear action, and also in their, you see, they have created at that time, they wanted to develop their economic relations with the US, with Europe, and they have created a financial instrument for that, which was the Russia Direct Investment Fund. I was on the board of this fund, so I saw the discussions they had. And from 2014, they shifted. And they say, okay, we close a bit. It's more difficult with the US. It's more difficult with Europe. So we need to develop our relation with China. We need to develop our relation with the Gulf. And they started to build a kind of alternative reality. It was an option because they kept the door open for a long time. But eventually they closed this door and they say, okay, now we are ready to finish Ukraine, to confront the West. And they had developed a complete ideology about an alternative world. I remember when I was advisor for multilateral affairs with President Chirac, and at that time, you see, we spoke a lot about, and France and Russia were very much aligned in discussing about multipolar world, renewal of multilateralism, rebalancing globalization, etc. But the way the Russians have developed this way of thinking, also the strange mix of, I would say, conspiracy theories, alternative vision of the world, and geopolitical mix. And at the end, I think they have ended believing in their fantasy. And they have attracted China on this path. And now, with what's happened in Ukraine, which is really a reality test, the Chinese realize that maybe they have not made a good bet. And they will, and everybody will have to cope to with the aftermath of the situation.
Just a couple of quick points. I think multipolarism is not the same as multilateralism, and certainly the Chinese are in favor of multipolarism, but their vision of multilateralism is not the same as ours. They want. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is a good example. The AIB, all these organizations, they are trying to shape a different world, and they are also trying to control, you know, the UN and other organizations where they play a key role. Just one thing on Kevin's comment on China's charm offensive in Europe. I think it's already happening. It's been happening for the past year or so. The problem is, due to the February 4th statement, the perception of China in Europe has become really bad. I mean, you look at the polls and surveys, and you look at, you know, China now being assimilated to Russia and not having very much positive things to offer. So, and from a sort of European official point of view, back to Mrs. von der Leyen or President Macron or whoever, it's very difficult to say, well, we're going to make friends with a country that is supporting the Ukraine invasion and that is actually not offering any positive model. So the problem is, of course, back to the multipolarism. There are a number of countries in the world that do not, and I think that was the point earlier in the previous panel with the president of Ghana, a number of countries that do not necessarily go along the Western view of the war, and the Europeans, of course, feel very deeply about it. So China's, back to the central question, I think China's approach on the Ukraine situation is critical for the next few years, and also in the relationship with Europe.
Thank you. I'd like to give an opportunity to the audience to, we have a microphone here, so Any questions for our distinguished panel? There's my dear friend, Anne-Marie Brady. Please.
Thank you, Professor Anne-Marie Brady from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and also ESM here at École Militaire. I'd like to challenge the very premise of the panel. First of all, what is war today? Kinetic war, we're seeing it now, but actually we've been seeing a lot of other forms of warfare, and China has reorganized its military in recent years around that other forms of warfare, like cyber attacks, knowing that it can't meet the capabilities of its main military rival, the United States. So that's the first question, what is war? And this is a big, big problem for our politicians right now, because how do they respond to the aggressive acts of countries like China and Russia? When do they meet the threshold? Or for NATO, when does an act meet the thresholds in which you take a response? So that's the first problem in our thinking. We have to recognise how much what's now been called foreign interference and the grey zone have changed the strategic environment and calculus. And the other point that I would make that I really challenge on this panel is this obsession in France, I notice, and generally in Europe, with blaming the problem on the US-China competition, and it's always the US first. I think if you do study Chinese foreign policy and Chinese politics, you will understand the agenda and the dynamic that China has, the importance of Taiwan in that, and also in the island chains. And if any change is made in that, it will affect everyone's security, and it's separate again from the US. So I think there's a willfulness and a blindness and a convenient rhetoric to echo what Laurent was saying, which I agree. I think there's a trap and fall into these convenient little explanations for the scenario. And my final point, as I would say, is in Chinese there's a saying, 内外有别, insiders and outsiders are different. So the problem is, when people try and understand China, is that many of the people who commentate it either can't read Chinese or don't like to read the kind of Chinese materials that you need to read, or can't access them, because 内外有别 is about the internal discussion. So internally, the Chinese government has been warning and preparing the Chinese people for war, the inevitability of war, for several years now. So whether we like it or not, that's how the government's talking to their own people and the overseas Chinese community. And this is the problem for us, I think. It just reminds me of history again and again. It's rather sad to see. I've been saying we're in a long 1930s, and I see similar behaviours, unfortunately.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Kevin, you want to?
Yeah, Anne-Marie, thank you for your contribution. You may be misreading the assumptions on the part of a number of us. Firstly, in my definition of war, given I wrote this book called The Avoidable War, let me respond directly to the proposition you've just put. War has a wide spectrum. And when you look at the Taiwan scenarios I outline, they go from anything from trade war, which is to economically strangle Taiwan, through to cyber, through to space, and frankly, multiple dimensions, including foreign influence activities around the world. So I think you'll find in what I've written, there's not the level of naivety which you would imply in your question, quite the reverse. The second is in terms of the narrative, which you referred to, I think, in Europe in particular, which is, well, it would all be fine in the end if these two external players would just get on. And then, as you, I think, correctly said, the United States often, by inference, is placed at the beginning of the queue in terms of why there is this thing emerging in terms of a fundamental strategic divergence between the American order and the putative Chinese order. I think there's some merit in your argument entirely there, because there is a failure to comprehend the notion and the content of the domestic Chinese narrative. And as you would have seen perhaps in the piece I've just published in Foreign Affairs on the ideological discourse about China's view not just of nationalism, but unfolding international struggle, 斗争, 国际制度之争, and that comes from 2014, as you know. It's not a recent phrase, and that is a struggle, armed or otherwise, with the United States and the West for the future of the international system. And so that is, I think, for those of us who have a clear-eyed view of these things, quite clear. The real question for the future is, in part, the analysis, which is what your 2 points of criticism go to. But for me, the primary question now is not so much one of analysis, because I think the analytical assumptions are beginning to shift around the world on these questions. The real questions are what to do about it, and that goes to the whole content of public policy. For my argument, I do not believe that either country is desiring to see a war over Taiwan this decade, though there's a risk, as I said before, of war by accident through incident and escalation. And so therefore the argument I put in this book about managed strategic competition is to create the safeguard mechanisms to reduce that risk, not eliminate it. The real challenge we face beyond that is what I do see to be Xi Jinping's personal timetable for Taiwan, which is in the 2030s. And that is, if there is not a benign, peaceful solution to the question by then, for which I don't see any basis in Taiwanese domestic politics, then the predisposition then for China not to have a war by accident, but a war by design, at a time when he would hope that China's degree of military and financial and economic resilience and capacity would be greater than it is now, and the risks of any loss or draw in such a war would be much less. And the policy answer on the part of the international community in dealing with that, which goes to questions which the panel has touched on as well, is how do you maximize collective deterrence against that possibility now? That is a military equation, it's an economic equation, it's a financial equation, it's a technological equation, and the object of it is as follows: to cause the PLA Command and the People's Bank of China in the early 2030s in their roundtable discussion with Xi Jinping to say to Comrade Chairman, Comrade Supreme Navigator, Comrade Great Helmsman, whatever his designation is by then, Comrade, the risks are still too great. The capabilities arrayed against us, both in all these divisions of power, including cyber, are too great, and we should not undertake this risk. And if that fails, and then we are into World War III, because there is no capacity to limit escalation of such a conflict, then the capabilities arraigned against Xi Jinping at that stage would at least render the outcome of such a conflict not an inevitable Chinese victory. That's the logic that I seek to advance.
Great. We have a question here.
Thank you, Jamil. I'd like to pose a simple question to the panel, and that is, what is the role of the United States dollar as a global currency in the context of the long-term conflict?
Wants to tackle the mighty dollar? Nobody. Okay, Kevin.
I'll have a quick go, just because I've had to think this through in the context of the book, Adrian. China is on the horns of a dilemma here because, A, it doesn't want to liberalize its currency because of its fears of exposure on international financial markets when its economy globally is still not dominant. And B, it certainly doesn't want to liberalize its capital account because it faces constraints in terms of its medium to long-term balance of payments. And they fear the flight of capital out of China for reasons of domestic political risk. So those are the two reasons why they've not liberalized and actually were created an alternative financial system, an alternative dominant global currency, or a dominant alternative source of readily tradable capital from within the Chinese system. At the same time, on the other part of their dilemma, they realize that this creates for them an impossible circumstance. Because if you move towards what I was just saying before in response to Anne-Marie's question about the 2030s over Taiwan, you remain then, in the early 2030s, entirely vulnerable to SWIFT, a dollar-denominated financial system, and the ability, therefore, depending on European and other political will, the imposition of comprehensive financial sanctions on China should they take military action to invade and occupy Taiwan. So what are they going to do about it? You've seen several efforts so far. SDRs, special drawing rights within the IMF, where the renminbi has been accepted into the basket of currencies. You see bilateral currency swaps now with 43 countries around the world in order to avoid the intermediation of the dollar in executing trade transactions around the world, but still not representing a significant percentage or proportion of global trade transactions. Thirdly, we now see the digital RMB. This is something which should be watched much more closely, given until the crackdown against Alibaba, China's likelihood of actually dominating the arteries of global digital commerce and then providing the software for digital finance to accompany it. And that debate's not over yet, given how slow the United States has been in competing with, let's call it, the digital commerce regime around the world. So my answer to your question, Adrian, is it is still in play, but is by no means certain that China has a way through this, which is easy, because the world and global financial markets, why do they keep going back to the greenback? It's reliable, and it represents domestically an enormous pool of readily investable capital around the world. Capital markets are deep and liquid and relatively secure against the alternatives.
We have a question here.
Thank you very much. Andres Velasco from the London School of Economics. Two quick questions. First one, building on the last issue here. Nobody has uttered the words financial crisis. I'm an economist. We don't know a lot. But one thing we do know is that any country that grew so fast for so long accumulated lots of bad loans in the financial system. China's had a property crisis. It hasn't had a full financial crisis. Will it ever happen? That's question number one. Question number two, one way you make yourself influential in the world is that you make other countries imitate you. You become a model. People want to follow you. 5 years ago, it was not entirely unthinkable that many countries, say in Africa, or maybe even in Central America, the Caucasus, would look to China and say, hey, that's a nice model. I want to be like you. Today, that seems a lot less likely. Does that make China less powerful?
Financial crisis. Emulation. You take the second one. Okay. I can tackle a little the first one if no one else wants to.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, back to the Ukraine question, I think the fact China has not taken an open stance on supporting Russia, even though they signed this statement, and the fact a number of countries are sort of rallying behind this neutral position is an interesting sign. You know, we heard from the president of Ghana earlier about, you know, in a very sort of refined way that, you know, China's action would be monitored and watched in Africa very, very closely. Again, in Europe, you know, the perception of China is not very good, has not improved ever since the start of this conflict, and you know, Europe has become more unified. So, you know, you have to look at other parts of the world, in the Middle East, in Latin America. You know, there are countries supporting the Chinese way, again, multipolar rather than multilateral. But if you take Southeast Asia, for example, you have many discrepancies. You have many countries that are against China, that try to, you know, stay away from China. That's the case with Vietnam, for example. That's the case with the Philippines, who have many territorial conflicts. So it's far from being a world leader in that sense, and it doesn't put on the table an alternative model. It doesn't want to do that. It's more of a revisionist power from the current system, and that's a problem, because if you want to be number one and you don't have a philosophy to offer or a model that is working, and again, I mean, Kevin told us very in great details about the current model and how it's working or not working. It's going to be very difficult. A lot of analysts are saying, look, China wants to be number one, but their system is still, there's the demographic issue, there's the real estate crisis, all of this. So it's a mixed bag, really.
On the financial crisis, I have some authority to speak on this. For 10 years, I was the banking correspondent in China for the Financial Times. So we struggled with this, and we thought about this a lot. And the conclusion, basically, that I came to, I wrote about it in columns and such, when the state owns the banking system effectively and most of the borrowers, and I looked at this through the prism of the great financial crisis in 2008, which we had to cover from afar. What happens in a financial crisis is a catastrophic loss of faith in your counterparty, effectively, right? And in China, if you have capital controls, which mean that the most you can get out of the country, and sometimes it's less, but the most is $50,000 a year. So if you're very unlikely to see bank runs, because you take it out of the Bank of China, you can only put it in the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China or Agricultural Bank of China. They're all owned by the same owner. They're all state-owned, so there's no difference. If you don't believe that the Communist Party is backing its banks, then where are you going to put your money? So it's very hard to see you see small bank runs on the very small banks, but it's unlikely to see the consumer giving up faith. And then it's very unlikely that these state banks are going to lose faith in each other. They're all owned by the same people, and they often get moved around. Like the chairman of this bank is often suddenly wakes up tomorrow, he's the chairman of that bank, and didn't realize he had to be the chairman of the other bank, but he does. And the companies, biggest companies, all state-owned. So are they going to pull their money out of the bank, or is the bank going to foreclose? What happens in China when a company is obviously bankrupt is the local government or the central government comes in and they say, right, you get them all in a room and you say, you lend to him and you lend to him, and then sort it all out, and otherwise you're all going to Qinghai or Xinjiang or wherever, and you sort it out. And that's what's been happening, by the way, for a decade, because there are bad loans throughout the system. The whole thing is a teetering mess of bad loans. But when the state controls the commanding heights and the entire financial system, it's very hard to see a crisis moment, a financial crisis as we think of it. What's much more likely, and what I think we are seeing and have been seeing for a long time, is ever decreasing rates of growth, because more and more money is being printed in order to pay off old loans. So it's the extend and pretend, it's borrowing from the bank to pay off the old loan or just to pay the interest. And that's what's been happening across the board. At some point, I talked to a good friend of mine at the BIS, and he was Korean, actually, and they're based in Asia. And he explained to me that at some point, the rest of the world sort of wakes up and says, oh my God, you're completely bankrupt, your whole country. But we're still quite far from that. I think that the world wakes up and says China is insolvent, the whole thing. But that could come. I mean, if it gets worse and worse and worse, and they keep covering it up, then, which is what they're doing. But the main point is your growth rates decrease because much of the new borrowing goes just to pay the interest on the old debt. There you go. Thought about it a lot. Right behind you is a question.
Yes, thank you. I'm not a professor from a school, I'm just a citizen. And I would like to ask a question about the nuclear weapon. I understood that the Second World War, actually, nuclear weapon was really part of the game. And I would like to know if the nuclear threat is part of this debate or not.
I'm not a nuclear expert, but China's official doctrine in terms of its nuclear weapons capabilities is non-first use. Secondly, in response to a range of pressures, internal and external, that doctrine is now under review. Where it will land and its conclusion point, none of us know, but it's under review. Thirdly, China is now rapidly developing its land-based forces. You would have seen the literature on the expansion of its ICBM force in central to western China, and the use of mobile launch systems as well in order to increase perceived vulnerability. It would still seem probable from the literature that the Chinese nuclear doctrine is based on the preservation of sufficient second strike capability in order to deter any first strike against it. That would seem to be the case. In Chinese conventional warfighting doctrine, there's scenarios for military engagement with the United States do not involve nuclear escalation. But the one caveat that I would add to this is as follows, and this is an extreme scenario, but it's worth reflecting upon for the moment. If we did end up in a catastrophic war between China and the United States, which did in fact prove to be, in the end, unavoidable, as opposed to soppy-minded international peaceniks like myself who think it might be avoidable. And if in such a conventional war that China was fully engaged militarily against the United States and involving preemptive strikes against Guam, United States sovereign territory, and against Okinawa, which is Japanese territory, as part of their warfighting operation and strategy. And let's just say under those circumstances there was a general and comprehensive American response, which inevitably there would be once American territory is violated. If the Chinese did not prevail and in fact lost such a conventional war, which is possible, although the Chinese military planners would say not probable, but it's possible, we should always be mindful of the fact that the Chinese system is such that the People's Liberation Army is a tool of the security of the Chinese Communist Party, and that if the party's regime came under threat, we could not rule out the threat of the use of all forms of weapons. That's a scenario which we should be mindful of. But it is not part and parcel of day-to-day military planning for the current set of conventional strategies. That would be an extremis.
Far there in the white. Yep. Yep, standing up. Thank you. Okay. I meant up there, but doesn't matter. Thank you.
I have the Michael. Can I say?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We believe in free speech.
I'm Xu Bo. I'm a professor in several management school, in particular in Paris. That's why I'm here. My neighbor warned me, it's pity we don't have a Chinese in the panel. So I look around. We have only few Chinese, maybe one Chinese people here. It's my privilege, my pleasure. Maybe I can say a few words regarding my view. I don't want to pretend Chinese view. We have a lot of issues has been discussed, even nuclear war, trade war, economic war, and we are talking about Chinese threats, a lot of problems. I'm Chinese, I'm sitting up here. I'm very sensitive to what you have talking. As Prime Minister rightly said, in current world, in current seminar, we have a lot of offers, a lot of this debate, but we don't have some solution, or we don't know how to translate accurate vision regarding China. Taking example of the threat of China, this is something in the newspaper in France, in Europe, in UK, in USA, everybody, every day we're talking about. But as Chinese citizen, you don't feel that. When you ask the people in China in the street, what is the biggest wish for them is to finish this zero COVID. They don't want to overthrow the world. They don't want to disturb this world. This world is perfect for them. They enjoy 40 years of economic prosperity. Nobody wants to change this world. This is a very general feeling. Ask people in Beijing, Shanghai. I'm Shanghainese. I'm living here for 3 years. I can't back to Shanghai because I don't want to have the quarantine. My mother told me, don't bike because time for you is very precious. Don't spend time for the quarantines. And ask Shanghai people, Beijing people, China people, they don't want to overthrow this world. They enjoy this order. Second example, taking the war against Taiwan or something, the Taiwan Strait tensions. For you, this is something imminent. But for China people, in the street or in the family discussion, nobody mentions it. Why we overthrow Taiwan? Because we want to, we are Chinese people don't kill Chinese people. So this is a very general feeling, but in this international debate, we are lack of this kind of things. You don't meet Chinese people. So I would like to maybe as their spokesman to share with you. Regarding Sino-US relation, I'm very sorry for that. I'm very for that because a long time before I'm working for Chinese government, I noticed how US is important for China. Remember in the year 2017, when President Xi visited US, he pivoted to Donald Trump. What he said? He said, we have 1,000 reasons to preserve this relationship. We have now to destroy it. This is only 2017. You can check it in the US media, Chinese media. And immediately, November 2017, Donald Trump pivoted to China. He has been received as an emperor, and even the door of Forbidden City is never open for a visiting head of state. So he has a visiting Forbidden City. Then in the Great Hall, he showed the video of his granddaughter, Annabella. Maybe some of you still remember. Annabella can speak Chinese, and she recites Tang poem. She sings Chinese song, and this is translated by Chinese CCTV. Whole nation applauds. The relationship is so good. In my opinion, the COVID war, Ukraine war, a lot of things have changed the world. But I'm wondering, do we lack of human intelligence? I mean, this kind of seminar, maybe one day, Premier, you're a Chinese and you know China very well, you have a lot of Chinese people. Why you don't host another seminar in China to discuss with Chinese people? Chinese people want the world. We can discuss. But for the time being, we lack of this kind of contacts. Even this is my opinions. We leave the propaganda. Do you think the propaganda is a reality?
Thank you very much for your useful perspective. I think it would be very difficult for us to have an open conversation like this in Beijing. Speaking as somebody who has lived in China for 22 years, and so, but thank you for your perspective. It's valuable.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? So there was the person earlier. I don't know if you can reach further up. Can you go up or not? Thank you.
Hi, Capucine. I was a Schwarzman Scholar 4 years ago in 2018, and I've been living in China ever since. As Subo mentioned, on the ground, the conversation is still very much COVID-related and less to do with the Ukrainian war. We've spoken a lot about the Ukrainian war. My sense is that prior to that, there was already an impact on China's international relations with COVID and the different reactions between the West and China. Could you speak to that, and what was this impact, please?
I'm mindful of the time, so we'll be quite brief. I think there have been three structural factors hard at work in the, let's call it the deterioration of the US-China relationship. One was the outbreak of the US-China trade war, which I think, as Shubor indicated before, came just after, frankly, the super state visit plus of Donald Trump to Beijing at the end of 2017. And that's when that all unfolded, quite apart from Trump's national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, doing a national security strategy then, which defined China as the strategic competitor. So you have the trade war had a big reverberative impact on the overall relationship. So much so that Xi Jinping is reported to have said in a Politburo meeting in April of 2019 that the United States, quote, is engaged in a 30-year-long struggle to prevent China's rise, for which the trade war is the first installment, unquote. That's the reported perception. I'll leave that to one side in terms of the accuracy of the analysis. The second, as you correctly anticipated in your question, is the dynamics unleashed by COVID. And remember, 2020 was a tricky year. First 3 months, none of us knew which way it was going to go in China. I think one of the great mistakes of the US administration at the time was not to reflect sufficient care, concern, compassion, as this began to wreak havoc across Wuhan and then elsewhere in China. And then as it evolved and broke out to the rest of the world, and then Trump began referring to it as the Kung flu, you had the radical politicization of what was, frankly, a pandemic crisis for all of humanity, whatever its origins happened to be. So that's, I think, factor number two in this. And then factor number three has been, with the election of the Biden administration, essentially the decision by the Biden administration to sustain the strategic framework of strategic competition. They've sought to amend elements of the content of it, and I believe seek to make it more systematic rather than President Trump's curious, quixotic approach to policy continuity. But these, I think, were these intersecting sort of big forces over the last several years. And underpinning it, an American assessment the balance of power was changing, increasingly in China's favor. And underpinning that, an assessment of Xi Jinping's strategy, one described before by Anne-Marie Brady, which was not to accept the status quo, but to unfold a series of actions in the international community to change the status quo in China's favor. That, I think, tries to pull the threads together.
We got 12 seconds left. Amazing. You're well practiced at this. I'm sorry we've run out of time. That was a bit of a marathon, especially for someone who just flew in overnight and didn't really sleep on the plane. But thank you so much to this really distinguished panel. I've learned a lot, and it was very enjoyable to see old friends, and I'm honored that I could be part of the launch of Asia Society France. It's a wonderful thing to have in this part of the world, and I want to congratulate everyone for making it happen, and happen so successfully today as well, this event. And please join me in thanking the panelists, and enjoy the lunch. Thank you.